Hello. So this slideshow is going to cover hands in general, get you to think about the ways that we use hands in our everyday life. And the slideshow is also going to introduce and explain the project that they'll be doing with hands. So hands, they are made of bone as well as lots of complex muscle tissue. It allows us to move our fingers and our thumb and our wrist all in sorts of ways. There's actually many tiny bones that make up the hands, which is why it's much more complicated when you do break a part of your hand. Our hands are part of our identity, not just in terms of a fingerprint or a handprint, but basically for a very, very long time, we have existed as humans with 5 fingers on each hand. Our hands are made up of different lines, shapes, wrinkles, and they're all unique. There are no two handprints that are exactly the same. Yes, you can learn about somebody according to their hand. With this photo here, we can see this person works out a lot. If you've ever heard of palmistry, that is where people read your palm to predict your future or information about your past. If you're very curious, do your own Google search about this. There's lots of cool information about palmistry. Hands can also tell us about somebody's age. So we have a photo here of a small baby's hand, maybe a middle-aged person's hand, and then a hand of someone who is much older. And we can tell definitely by the skin condition. We decorate our hands in order to communicate something about ourselves. Our hands allow us to use all different types of tools. That's because our fingers can manipulate in various ways in order to hold all different types of tools, all different forms. And you can see our fingers, right? For knitting, our fingers have to move in a certain way in order to manipulate the needles and the yarn, even to learn to use scissors, right? Think about it when you were a little child and you're learning how to use scissors. To us, we take it for granted now that we are older, but when you're a little child, it's a very complex thing. Our hands often reflect how we feel. So we often show our feelings with our hands as well. It's a way that we communicate with others. Yes, we can use words and facial expressions, but we also use our hands. There's also ASL, which is American Sign Language. So it's another way that we communicate. So if you are deaf, which means you cannot hear very well or you cannot hear at all, you might learn to use American Sign Language, which is a series of hand movements and gestures to communicate information. If these moving images are entertaining you, just search ASL GIF or ASL GIFs on Google, and you'll find lots of very interesting short little videos that will teach you common ASL gestures. Our hands communicate through greetings, signs, and symbols as well. And did you know the handshake in ancient Greece was originally believed to be used to make sure that the person you were meeting wasn't carrying a concealed weapon? So that means if someone is reaching out towards you to shake your hand, that might mean they're not going to try to kill you later on. So again, we talk with our hands, right? So Did you know that people who talk with their hands, they move their hands a lot as they're speaking to somebody? They tend to be more viewed as warm, agreeable, and energetic versus those who don't move their hands as much, which might seem more logical, cold, and analytical. So think about a teacher you've had in the past. You might have a teacher who uses their hands a lot when they talk. Does that teacher come off as more energetic versus maybe a teacher who just stands and maybe holds a piece of paper while talking to the class? So hand gestures, they help us understand what's in our minds. And there's actually a brain region known as the Broca's area that's actually partly responsible for this. So this area of the brain has developed to allow us to understand people as they're talking with their hands. It's connected to speech production, but it's also active when people are waving their hands around as they're talking. So, hand motions, they can often reveal information that might be absent versus what we're saying when we're speaking. For example, a gesture might say that this particular point in the idea is more important than others, or the speaker is actually still thinking about that idea. Now, this is something really interesting. So, next time you go to a job interview or you're preparing for a job interview, think about what you'll be doing with your hands. And hand gestures, they're actually part of the healthy development of a child. So when a parent uses hand gestures with their child early in life, right, as a baby, as a toddler, if they use hand gestures, it can actually predict a child will later develop a strong vocabulary, which relates to sentence structure and storytelling. They often tell parents, talk a lot to your baby, talk as much as possible because it helps them learn language. But using hand gestures as well can help develop a strong vocabulary. So let's learn about what your ceramic hands project is. You've been spending a few days practicing making hands, looking at your own hand, studying parts of the hand, but now we're actually going to apply it towards a art project. So remember that our hands allow us to use tools. The fingers manipulate in various ways, including the thumb. Don't forget the thumb. They manipulate in many ways to allow us to hold objects, um, manipulate objects, right? Think about when you wedge the clay, what your fingers are doing. So the objectives of this project, you're using additive and subtractive processes, which are sculptural processes, to construct a hand and parts of the hand. You're making observations of your own hand while constructing a proportional hand made of clay. You're using a variety of pottery tools to carve and sculpt the clay, and you're going to be creating a clay hand holding an object. That is the project. Your clay hand is going to be holding an object. So while these hands look really cool on their own, we're going to have our hands holding an object. So here's some actual student examples. You will notice that this hand is actually hollow. So that is something we're going to be talking about later on as we work on this project. Again, I will be demonstrating parts of this project as we're working together as a class. Now this photo here, we can see the photo reference of what the person used versus the actual finished product. So the object you're going to be making, the object your hand is holding, is also going to be made out of clay. So everything is going to be made out of clay. Now, these are some painted examples. Some of these do hold real objects, but again, our project is going to hold an object made out of clay. And you have lots of choices of that type of object you could use. These are definitely more symbolic, but it gives you an example of what they would look like if they're painted. Now, your hands, those should still have details such as the fingernails, the creases on the outside of the hand, creases on the inside of the hand, proportion. So we don't want to forget about the other parts of your hand. We're going to be able to see your sculpture in the round, which means we can see the back, the front, and the sides of the hand. So there are some requirements for this sculpture. All 5 fingers should be visible, so your fist cannot be closed around the object. All 5 fingers, we should be able to see them. The sculpture is going to end at the wrist, not at the bottom of the palm, but there's no specific height for this project because it really depends on the gesture of your hand and the object it is holding. The object that you're going to be holding is made out of clay. We do need to include details, as I mentioned, such as the nails, the creases, even the muscle, depending on what your hand looks like. We want to actually capture those areas of the muscle. The hand should be realistic and proportional to your hands. We're not making a tiny little sculpture. We're also not making hands that look cartoony. We're going for realism. So as I said, your hand is going to be holding an object. That object could be personally symbolic to you. It could just be a regular everyday object. It could be some sort of food. It could represent something that's important to you. So it could be something that's metaphorical rather than a tangible object. And we're actually going to be working from sketches of your hand. We're going to be doing we're going to be taking photos of your hand holding an object similar to what you'll be making out of clay, and then we'll be using those photos to also make some sketches. This helps us understand the placement of the fingers, the proportions, the gesture. So this is just something to keep in mind. We will be doing a few sketches. However, your drawings will not be as detailed as these ones because these drawings were actually meant for a drawing-based project. But you can see on the photo on the top right, you can actually pick apart the hand into sections just using shapes. And this would be very helpful if you were making this out of clay. So how do you start? First, again, we have been spending some time looking at the parts of the hand, practicing just a hand on its own. But first, think about what object you want your hand to hold. How is that hand going to hold the object? Once you've figured out that object, you, with the help of a classmate or Miss J, we're going to take several reference photos of your hand. We're going to need to see different viewpoints, and you'll be actually putting these photos inside a Google slide so I can access it and you can access it later on. So just keep in mind, these photos will be submitted in Canvas. We want to see that hand from all different angles because, again, as you're making it out of clay, we're also going to be seeing all the different sides of your sculpture. You're going to be using those reference photos and your own hand, don't forget your own real hand, to create sketches to figure out the position for each joint and each digit of that hand. So again, here are some sketches I will be showing you later, kind of how you can draw your hand, picking it apart into shapes rather than focusing so much on the shading and the color. So here's my 2 sketches that I worked on. The sketching allows you to look closely at what you will need to construct later on. Also, it helps you become familiar with the gesture of the hand and the placement of the fingers and thumb. Again, it really all depends on the object that your hand is holding. After you create the sketches, you're going to begin constructing with clay according to the method that I will be demonstrating in class.